A message that used to take 10 days now took a few seconds. That is the fact I keep turning over in my hands. For most of human history, a letter moved at the speed of a horse, or a ship, or a man on foot, and nobody alive had ever known anything different. A father in New York who wanted to tell his son in California that his mother had died would write the words, "Hand the paper to a rider," and then wait. Wait while the rider crossed the plains. Wait while the news crossed the mountains. 2 weeks might pass, 3 weeks, before the son even knew. And then, in the space of a single building season, in the year 1861, a thin iron wire was strung across roughly 2,000 miles of open American country, and the distance between the two coasts simply collapsed. A man in Washington could speak to a man in San Francisco before the sun had moved across the sky. And here is the part that stops me. They did it in months. Not years. Months. They had no machines for this. No trucks to haul the poles. No power tools to dig the holes. No helicopters, no concrete mixers, no diesel engines of any kind. They had axes, wagons, oxen, mules, and the muscle and the backs of a few hundred men. They had a treeless plain that grew almost no wood for poles, and a desert that grew none at all. They had buffalo by the 100,000, and weather that could kill a man in an afternoon, and they crossed the hunting grounds of nations who had every reason to be wary of a wire running through their land. And still, between the spring and the late autumn of one year, they wired a continent. I want to walk you through exactly how. Because the more I read of the records, the less it looks like a story about technology, and the more it looks like a story about ordinary people doing something that should not have been possible. Let me set the scene first. By the late 1850s, the telegraph was already an old miracle in the East. Cities from Boston to St. Louis were laced together with wire, and a businessman in one town could trade words with a partner in another in minutes. California had its own small network too, knitting San Francisco to Sacramento and a few towns between. But in the middle of the country lay nearly 2,000 miles of nothing. No wire, no way across except the slow way. The two halves of the nation were electrically deaf to each other. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. Into that silence rode the Pony Express. You have probably heard of it. Young riders, fast horses, relay stations strung across the wilderness from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, a route of nearly 1,900 miles. The riders carried mail in a leather mochila and changed horses every 10 or 15 miles, riding day and night through heat and snow and the threat of attack. At its best, the Pony Express could carry a letter coast to coast in about 10 days. That was the fastest the news had ever moved across the continent. 10 days. People marveled at it. And it is worth remembering this, because the Pony Express is the very thing the wire was about to make obsolete. The riders were the ceiling. The wire was about to go straight through that ceiling. Now, the idea of a telegraph line across the whole continent was not new. People had dreamed of it for years, but most serious men thought it was a fantasy. The distance was too great. The country in between was too empty, too dry, too dangerous. Where would you even get the poles? Out on a plain that grew no trees. Who would protect the line? And who on earth would pay for it before it could ever earn a dollar back? The answer came in two parts. The first part was the government. In June of 1860, President James Buchanan signed the Pacific Telegraph Act. The law promised a federal subsidy of up to $40,000 a year for 10 years to whoever would build and maintain a line from the Missouri River to the Pacific. It was a way of sharing the risk, of telling private companies that the country wanted this badly enough to help pay for it. California had already promised a smaller sum the year before, $6,000 a year, to help bring the wire to its own side of the gap. The second part was a man. His name was Hiram Sibley. Say it, Sibley. He was the president of the Western Union Telegraph Company. When the contract went out to bid, every other company that had shown interest got cold feet and pulled out before the deadline. Every one. Sibley alone held his nerve. Western Union took the contract. Sibley had argued for this line when his own board thought it was madness, and now the whole thing rested on his shoulders. Sibley did not build it himself, of course. The work was split between two companies acting for Western Union. The Pacific Telegraph Company would build west, starting from Omaha, Nebraska, climbing toward Salt Lake City. The Overland Telegraph Company would build east, starting from Carson City, just over the line from California, also aiming for Salt Lake City. The two crews would race toward each other across the empty middle of the country, and where they met, the continent would be joined. To run the eastern crew, the one building west out of Omaha, Western Union turned to a man named Edward Creighton. Say it, Creighton. He was the son of Irish immigrants, a man who had grown up grading roads and stringing telegraph wire across Ohio and the Midwest, learning the work from the dirt up. He was not a financier in a fine office. He was a builder who knew how to move men and animals and material across hard country. And before a single pole went into the ground, Creighton did something that tells you everything about the kind of man he was. In the dead of winter, late in 1860, he went out to scout the route himself. He rode by stagecoach from Omaha as far as he could, then went on by horseback into the mountains and the desert, surveying the ground the wire would have to cross. The snow was deep. The cold was brutal. By the accounts that survive, his face was frostbitten before he was done. He wanted to see with his own eyes where the rivers ran, where a man might find water, where the grass would feed the oxen, and above all where, in all that emptiness, he might find timber for the poles. He covered the whole distance in the worst season of the year, so that when the building began, he would not be guessing. That ride, alone, in the snow, is the first thing I would put on a monument to this line, if anyone ever built one. Now, the tools they actually had, I want you to picture them clearly, because the modern mind keeps reaching for machines that were not there. The pole was the heart of the problem. The line needed a pole roughly every 75 yards. Across the full route, they would set more than 27,000 poles. And the Great Plains, where much of the line had to go, grew almost no wood fit for a telegraph pole. The land was grass to the horizon, beautiful and empty, and useless for timber. So the poles had to come from somewhere else. They were cut wherever wood could be found, in the mountains, along the rivers, and then hauled out onto the treeless ground by wagon, sometimes for great distances. Every pole on the open plain was a pole that men and oxen had dragged there from miles away. Think about that the next time you see a single, weathered telegraph pole standing in a field. Somebody hauled it there behind an ox. The wire was single-strand iron, galvanized against the weather, said in the records to be of the best quality they could get. It was held to each pole by a glass insulator set into an iron bracket, so the current would run along the wire and not leak away into the wet wood. Spools of that wire, glass insulators by the crate, kegs of nails, tools, food, tents, and feed for the animals all had to move with the crews, because there were no towns out there to buy from. The supply train was the lifeline. If it failed, the whole line stopped. And then there were the animals and the men. Creighton's outfit, building west, was an army of work. The records describe a train of more than 100 wagons, 400 men, and 500 oxen and mules. 100 wagons, 500 animals, 400 men. All of it crawling west across the grass at the pace of an ox, which is to say at a walk, setting a line of wooden poles behind them as they went, like a needle drawing a thread across the whole face of the country. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access, 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. So how did they actually build it? Let me take you through the method, because this is the part I find almost unbelievable, and it is the part the history books usually skip. The work moved in waves. Out ahead of everything went the scouts and the men who chose the exact path, following the route Creighton had surveyed, picking the line that would cross the rivers at the best fords and find the easiest grades. Behind them came the men who hauled and distributed the poles, dropping them along the route at the right spacing, every 75 yards or so, a long broken line of bare timber lying in the grass. Then came the diggers. With nothing but hand tools, men dug a hole for every single pole. Across 2,000 miles, more than 27,000 holes dug by hand by tired men, one after another after another. Behind the diggers came the crews who raised the poles and tamped them in, packing the earth back around each one so it would stand against the wind. And behind them came the wiremen, who ran the iron wire from pole to pole, fixed it to the glass insulators, drew it tight, and tied off the joints. And behind all of that came the supply wagons, the cooks, the herders watching the oxen, the men mending harness and shoeing animals, and keeping the whole moving town fed and alive in a place with no stores and no help. When all of those waves were working in rhythm, the line grew at a speed that astonished everyone who saw it. The eastern crew dug its first post hole in early July of 1861 and set off west. By the 5th of August, they had reached Fort Laramie, deep in what is now Wyoming. Across the best stretches, the crews were laying down something on the order of 5 miles of finished telegraph line in a single day. 5 miles a day. Poles cut and hauled, holes dug, poles raised, wire strung, all of it done in a day after day, by hand and by ox. And because the current could not carry the full distance on its own, they built relay stations along the way, roughly every 20 miles, little outposts where an operator would receive a faint message and send it on fresh down the next stretch of wire. So even as they built, they were creating not just a line, but a living chain of stations and operators across the wilderness. The route itself was a feat of judgment before it was ever a feat of labor. From Fort Laramie, the line climbed steadily west toward the high country and threaded the Continental Divide at South Pass, the broad, gentle saddle through the Rockies that the wagon trains had used for years because a loaded ox could actually pull a load over it. Creighton had walked that ground in the winter for exactly this reason. He knew where the wire could follow the easy grades and where it had to cross the rivers, and the crews trusted the line he had drawn. Without that survey, the season would not have been enough. The pace they kept was only possible because one man had already suffered the route in advance and come back with it in his head. But first, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories like this one unless enough people click. One click. Come back. Now the cost. Not the dollar cost, though we will come to that. The human and natural cost of building across that country. The weather was the first enemy, and the most patient one. On the high plains and in the mountain passes, a clear morning could turn into a killing storm by afternoon. There were lightning strikes that could run down the wire and burst an insulator. There were winds that leaned on the poles and snows that buried the work. The men slept in tents on open ground for months, far from any roof, eating from wagons, drinking from rivers and seeps. There was no hospital out there. There was no rescue. If a man took sick or broke a leg, the country itself was the doctor, and the country did not care. Then there were the buffalo. This is one of those details that sounds almost like a joke until you understand the scale of it. The plains held bison in numbers we can barely imagine now, vast herds that moved like weather across the grass. And a telegraph pole, planted in open ground, turned out to be a wonderful thing for a buffalo to scratch against. A bull bison could weigh well over 1,000 pounds, 1,500 pounds, and more. When an animal that size leaned in to rub an itch, the pole would simply give way and come down, and the wire with it. Whole stretches of line could go down to nothing more than itchy buffalo. The companies tried fighting it. By one account, they drove sharp spikes into the poles to discourage the rubbing, and it backfired completely. The spikes only gave the animals a better scratch, and the buffalo were said to travel and fight one another to get at the poles with the spikes in them. Out there, the bison were a force the engineers simply had to live with. And then there is the harder part of the story, the part I want to tell honestly. The line ran through the homelands of the Plains nations, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and others, people who had lived on that land long before any wire crossed it. The companies negotiated for the right to pass, and for a time, there was an uneasy peace around the line. But the relationship was never simple, and it did not stay peaceful. One account from that first summer describes a party of Sioux warriors cutting a finished section of the line and carrying off a long length of the wire, which made fine, bright material for bracelets and ornaments. There is a story, and I tell it as the story it is, that some who wore the wire fell ill, and that a medicine man read it as the spirit of the talking wire taking its revenge, and that the line was let alone for a while after. Whether that is exactly how it happened, I cannot prove to you. What is certain is that the wire ran through lands that were not empty, that the people there understood what it meant, and that, in the years to come, as the wars on the plains worsened, the line would be cut again and again, and crews would have to ride out into real danger to mend it. The wire did not arrive in a wilderness. It arrived in someone's country. Now here's something I have to say plainly, the way this channel always tries to. We know the names of the men at the top. Edward Creighton, who built West. James Gamble, who built East. Hiram Sibley, who held the contract when everyone else ran. We know about the Chief Justice who sent the first message and the governor who answered. But the 400 men in Creighton's crew, the ones who actually dug the 27,000 holes and hauled the poles and strung the wire and slept in the cold, those men are almost entirely nameless in the record. We have the number 400, and we have almost nothing else. No roll of who they were, where they came from, who waited for them at home, which of them got hurt. The records count the poles. The records count the miles. The records do not count the men. And I think that silence is its own kind of monument, and we should at least stand in front of it for a moment before we move on. While the eastern crew under Creighton was crossing the plains, the western crew under James Gamble was building toward them from the other side. Gamble was an experienced telegraph man out of California, and his job was every bit as hard, working east from Carson City across the Nevada desert toward Salt Lake City. Say it, Carson. His was the country with no wood at all, the dry basin and range, where every pole and every drop of water had to be carried. From Salt Lake City itself, other supervisors, men named James Street and W.H. Stebbins, pushed crews out in both directions to help close the gap from the middle. So it was not a simple two-way race. It was a converging effort, crews reaching toward one another across the last of the empty country, all of them aiming at the same Utah city. And the two lines met, as planned, at Salt Lake City on the 24th of October, 1861. One quick note. I turned the full story of the first transcontinental telegraph into a book. Everything the records gave me, all the names and all the numbers. If you want it, the link is in the description. Picture that day. The eastern wire had come down out of the mountains and reached the city by the 18th of October. The western wire closed the final gap on the 24th. And the moment the last connection was made, for the first time in the history of the world, a man on the Atlantic side of the continent could send words to a man on the Pacific side and have them arrive in seconds. The whole width of North America, which had taken a Pony Express rider 10 days at a hard gallop, now took less time than it takes me to finish this sentence. The first messages went out almost at once, and they were not idle. Remember the year, 1861. The country was at war with itself. The Civil War had begun that spring, and there was real fear that the far western states, so distant and so isolated, might drift loose from the Union. So the very first transcontinental messages were, in part, about loyalty. The Chief Justice of California, a man named Stephen Field, sent one of the first telegrams across the new line to President Lincoln in Washington. By the record, he announced that the telegraph to California had that day been completed, and he called it a bond of perpetuity, an everlasting bond, between the states of the Atlantic and those of the Pacific. It was a promise, sent in lightning, that California would stay with the Union. And from Salt Lake City, Brigham Young, the leader of the Mormon settlers in Utah, had already sent his own message when the Eastern Wire first reached his city. By the record, he wired that Utah had not seceded, but was firm for the Constitution and the laws of the country, and was warmly interested in such useful enterprises as the one so far completed. So the Wire, in its first hours, was carrying exactly the thing the country most needed in that frightening year. It was carrying word that the West was still bound to the rest. That is the part of this story that always surprises people. We think of the telegraph as a convenience, a way to send business news faster. But in that moment, in that war, the wire was something closer to a nerve. It let Washington feel the far edge of the country and know it was still there. The Pony Express had carried Lincoln's first inaugural address west in record time only months before. Now even that record was finished, replaced by something that moved at the speed of electricity. Now, the result. The scale of what they had done. In a single building season, in roughly 4 months of hard pushing, the crews had set more than 27,000 poles and strung about 2,000 miles of single-strand iron wire across some of the emptiest and hardest country on the continent. They had done it with 100 wagons and 500 animals and 400 men on the eastern side alone, with no machines in the open air fighting weather and buffalo and distance the entire way. The whole project is said to have cost on the order of $500,000, an enormous sum for the time. and it paid for itself almost at once. The line was so useful, so immediately in demand, that the rates people paid to send messages across it made the telegraph stock soar. Edward Creighton, who had ridden frostbitten through the snow to scout the route, came out of it a wealthy man, holding stock in the very companies he had built for. He had laid the solid foundation of a fortune out there in the grass. And there was one more result, sudden and final. The Pony Express. That marvel of speed, those young riders and fast horses, the 10-day miracle. 2 days after the wire was joined at Salt Lake City, the Pony Express announced that it was finished. After about 18 months of riders crossing the continent at a dead run, the whole enterprise was made obsolete in an instant by a wire that did the same trip in seconds. The Pony Express had spent its short life bridging the gap between the Eastern and Western telegraph networks. The moment that gap was closed by wire, there was nothing left for the riders to do. They were the fastest thing the old world had. The wire was the first thing of the new one. I find that handoff almost unbearably moving. The horse and the rider, the oldest way of carrying a message, defeated not in a race, but simply by being made unnecessary. Overnight, by a thread of iron strung on wooden poles. An age ended in those 2 days, quietly, with a press notice. And the men who had ridden so hard, who had risked so much, woke up one morning to find that the thing they did best was no longer needed by anyone. The Pony Express had not even managed to turn a profit. It had been a heavy gamble that ran out of time the moment the wire arrived. So what remains today? Of all that work, the original line is gone. The single iron wire that crossed the continent in 1861 did not last long as the cutting edge. Within a few years, the railroad would come the same way, and heavier, better telegraph lines would follow the tracks, and the first thin wire across the open plains would be replaced and forgotten. The poles rotted or fell or were taken down. The buffalo that knocked them over were themselves slaughtered nearly to nothing within a single generation. The relay stations emptied out. If you drive across Nebraska and Wyoming and Utah today, along the old route, you will mostly see the same grass and sage and far horizons the crews saw, and almost no sign that the line was ever there at all. A historical marker here and there, a name on a county, little else. But some of it remains in ways you would not expect. Edward Creighton, the builder who scouted in the snow, took the fortune the telegraph gave him and never forgot where he came from. When he died, his widow, Mary Lucretia Creighton, left $100,000 to found a college in Omaha in his memory. By the time that college opened its doors, the bequest had grown until it had nearly doubled. The college became Creighton University, and it stands and teaches to this day. So the man who strung the wire across the plains is remembered not by a length of cable, but by a university full of students, most of whom have no idea that their school is named for a man who once dug the first post hole of a line across a continent. And the deeper legacy is the one we live inside and never notice. Every instant message, every coast-to-coast call, every video that crosses the country in the blink of an eye, all of it descends from that first thin iron wire and that first impossible season of work. The idea that distance is no barrier to a word, that a person on one ocean can reach a person on the other in the time it takes to think it, that idea began here, in the grass, with axes and oxen and 400 unnamed men. Before that October, the country was 2 halves that had to shout across a gap of 10 days. After it, the country could speak to itself in a single breath. We have never gone back. I keep coming back to the holes. More than 27,000 of them, dug by hand, one after another, across 2,000 miles of open country in a single year. No machine touched them. Just men with tools and animals to haul the wood and a route of frostbitten Irishmen had ridden out alone in the snow. They strung a wire across the whole width of America in the time it takes a season to turn, and then most of them vanished from the record entirely, leaving behind only the miles and the silence, and a country that could finally hear itself coast to coast. We do not know their names, but we are still living in the world they wired. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shoutout in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss Tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.